Welcome, everyone. The sun is shining. It's a beautiful day out there, and I mean that literally and metaphorically. So welcome, and thank you all for being here. My name is Jonathan Rose. I'm the head of the Department of Political Studies. Can everyone hear me at the back? Great. I wanted to begin by, first of all, acknowledging that we are situated on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. To acknowledge this territory is to recognize that there have been indigenous peoples who have lived here long before Western settlers, and it's also to acknowledge the significance of this territory for people who still live, learn, and play here. Recently, this week, in fact, Murray Sinclair, who was an indigenous leader and the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and also Queen's University's chancellor, reminded us that reconciliation is not an Aboriginal problem. It is a Canadian problem. It involves all of us. Referring to residential schools, Murray Sinclair said that education is what got us into this mess, and education will get us out of this mess. So I think as we sit here and learn from our speaker, we should keep that in mind, that that is an important element of why we are here, to learn. And speaking of learning, John Meisel, for whom this lecture is named, is one of Canada's most beloved and influential political scientists. He taught at Queen's for decades. And he turned 101 years old, as the sign here says, just last week, which makes him, must be clearly the oldest living political scientist in the world. And I visited him a couple times over the last few months, and his body's frail, but he still has that great twinkle in his eye. And when I told him about the speaker this year, I understood immediately that he knew who I was talking about, and he smiled profusely. So I was very happy about that. For years, John taught the first year political science class and mentored some of Canada's most engaging students who went on to have significant and important positions in business, academia, public service. And if you go outside of Queen's, or when you graduate Queen's for those students here, and you mention his name, folks, your parents, and maybe even your grandparents will recognize that name if they took anything near political science. He was an academic who was truly engaged. John's learning was not confined to the classroom. He believed in translating ideas to the world of public policy. He was a professor, but he was also the head of the Canadian Radio, Television, Communications Commission. So he was actively engaged in policy making. His advice was sought by ministers and prime ministers for years. And as I said, he's taught many generations of scholars on how to think about elections, political parties, cultural policy, and Quebec. Much of the work that folks do in this area really owes a debt to John Meisel. He was the founding editor of the International Political Science Review, and in assuming that mission, he said one of the lessons he wanted was to share Canada's political culture and to share with colleagues around the world about what they could learn from Canada. So he was truly an academic who was engaged not only in the world of policy, but in ensuring that Canadian ideas were spread internationally. And that's a bit of a foreshadowing for our talk today, by the way. John had huge legacy, and one of the most important legacies is a forum for addressing compelling and profound political issues facing scholars, policymakers, and the public. This is the 6th installment of the lecture series, and it has featured folks who've spoken about contemporary political controversies ranging from race, Indigenous reconciliation, violence against women, the failures of liberalism, and the devastating power of social media. All of the talks have the same format. It's a 40-minute talk followed by a question and answer period. And this will be the same. This year's talk, Maximum Democracy, or Learning to Love the Public, continues this illustrious tradition of forcing us to rethink assumptions. And for those of my students who are here, you'll know that I think one of the most important roles of a liberal arts education is to emerge with assumptions that have been rethought and re-examined. And I think that today's speaker will do that. One of the great things about being a university professor is to be able to teach really bright, exceptional young people and watch them grow intellectually, creatively, and professionally. And I had the privilege of teaching Peter MacLeod some years ago. I won't say when for fear of outing both of us. And at that time, I was just reviewing a letter of reference I wrote. I have to say this. And it was just after he graduated the MA program here. And I said, Peter is one of the most original creative thinkers I've ever met. And I think I would still say that now more than ever. He, at the time, and as you'll hear now, is not confined to narrow disciplinary silos, and he's interested in bringing a fresh, radical new way to think about contemporary problems. What began as a teacher-student relationship with me as the teacher and Peter as the student has flipped. And it's not an exaggeration to say that it is he who teaches me, and I'm happy to sit back and learn Peter. Peter's passion for civic engagement and trust and in the capacity of citizen goes to the heart of some of the most important questions facing political science today. Should we trust citizens? And after this week, I don't even need to finish a sentence. Peter MacLeod is the principal of MAS LBP and one of Canada's leading experts in public engagement and deliberative democracy. Since its founding in 2007, MAS has completed more than 250 major policy projects for governments and public agencies across Canada. His work popularizes civic lotteries and citizens' assemblies and has earned international recognition for its work. He writes and speaks frequently about citizens' experience of the state, the importance of the public imagination, something I'm sure you'll hear about today, and the future of responsible government. He is the recipient of Public Policy Forum's Young Leaders Award. He is a regular speaker on television, appears in newspapers, and is a much sought-after speaker for governments of all political stripe. Peter and his colleague are the authors of a forthcoming book from University of Toronto Press, coming out next fall, called Democracies, Second Act. Let me just conclude by saying John Meisel himself wrote of the importance of, quote, not simply to be committed to a professional or private domain, but to a public world and in a public language. And I think that summarizes Peter MacLeod well. Please join me in welcoming back to Queen's, Peter MacLeod.
What a delight to be able to join you, the circumstances of this week notwithstanding. And Jonathan's been too kind in saying that he might learn a couple of things from our work. It's only because of the incredibly formative experience that I had here at Queen's and because of his leadership in a project that I will of course discuss, that I'm able to stand here and talk about anything with whatever insights I can muster. Okay, so I want to of course thank you for coming. I was not only a student of John Meisel's, of Jonathan Rose's, I was a student of John's. And I think you could probably tell from the beautiful introduction and just seeing these photos and maybe your own memories as well that, all of us have benefited from John and this institution, perhaps most of all, because he was an intellectual. But he was an intellectual who was viscerally engaged in the world, and he was playfully engaged with the world. And it's part of what makes returning to Queen's to give this address in his 101st year very special to me. Like Jonathan, because my talk is about governance, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the recent passing of Murray St. Clair. Putting aside anything I want to say about the future of democracy this afternoon, it's actually the prospect of true reconciliation and the hybridization of our Western and Indigenous approaches to governance that, to my mind, are amongst the absolutely most exciting sources for our political renewal. And St. Clair should be remembered by all of us for his incredible fortitude and for showing us the path we have to follow. Third, to point out the obvious, I can now see that it may have been a bold choice to schedule this particular lecture 48 hours after the US election, an election that many of us, myself included, sorely wished had turned out very differently. I'm afraid there's no... the dog actually sighs on cue. Because look, there's no sugar-coating any of this or what's ahead. The repercussions of the election are profoundly destabilizing, and they're going to continue to play out for decades to come. The idea that Trump's first election was an aberration from a normal democratic order is dead, and so too is any claim to American exceptionalism in the face of rising autocracy. What we cannot do, however, is to allow this election to teach us the wrong lessons about the public, which is to say, about each other. Leaping ahead, there's only one lesson to take. It's that when we do not energetically and unapologetically work to enlarge the democratic experience of everyone, then darker forces prevail. And this is why I've called this lecture Maximum Democracy, or Learning to Love the Public. What I want to show is that our mature democracy is in fact a minimum democracy, one that reflects our profound skepticism about the public. And it's a skepticism that runs throughout our history. And in this particular moment, as we watch an American majority elect a felon and a demagogue, I understand why it might even seem prudent. It is nevertheless a trap, because this skepticism is what disables us from the two things democracies need to thrive: an audacious commitment to realizing human capability, and the experience of the state as an effective platform for human and social development. So what I want to describe is a more maximal version of democracy, but one that has very little to do with voting or the conventional things we imagine when we think about being more democratic. But to get to this version, we have to talk about what the public is and what it means to be democratic. I want to do this with three accounts. First, a moment to acknowledge where we are, but also how history can guide us. Then, to describe our paradoxical relationship to the public. And third, to sketch out what I think maximum democracy can look like. In his final album, just weeks before his death, Leonard Cohen asked, "You want it darker?" No, I don't think any of us really do. But I am going to get dark for a minute.
I won't dwell on the likely impact of the Trump administration, but when we look around the world, we might say heavily that it's very much on trend. Britain has earned itself a temporary reprieve, but only following the populist fraud that was Brexit and 12 years of austerity delivered by no fewer than 5 Tory prime ministers. The eminent epidemiologist Sir Michael Marmot credits these policies with as many as 1 million premature deaths in Britain. In Germany, a country that vowed never again, is once again electing far-right parties even after constitutional courts have ruled them to be subverting the German state and with it liberal democratic norms. And last night, its stoplight coalition crumbled. In France, we have the National Front hastily assembled in an attempt to hold off Le Pen's national rally. The Netherlands struggles to sustain a government with its most popular politician, the previously heretical Geert Wilders, himself not able to take the helm but pulling most of the strings. We see Commonwealth countries like India, the world's biggest democracy, deepening its ties with autocrats. We see Mexico determined to sabotage the independence and efficacy of its judiciary. And then here at home. Here at home, we know that Canada is not immune. Like in other countries, the pandemic provided cover for a different kind of virus to spread, culminating in a spasm of lawlessness on the front steps of Parliament. And a new generation of conservatives cheered on and coddled protesters, no matter how extreme or implausible their demands. Canada's largest provinces treat the Charter like an inconvenience rather than an obligation, while they and others openly defy the authority of the federal government. And the situation for too many elected politicians is no better. If representative democracy depends in large measure on the decency of good people willing to stand for public office, we should be alarmed that fully 9% of municipal politicians in Quebec elected in 2021 have resigned. They cite an environment of near constant harassment, leaving them to conclude that the job just isn't worth the cost to themselves or their family. And sadly, we shouldn't be surprised that the majority of resignations come from women and racialized office holders. Of course, we've been too slow to recognize that lurking beneath and fanning much of this democratic dysfunction are the agents of what might best be called anti-democracies, Russia and China chief amongst them, and their domestic enablers. We're naive, if not totally complacent, about the extent to which we've permitted our information sphere to become compromised. The most florid and toxic examples of free speech increasingly appear to be examples of paid speech, seeded by malignant bot farms working to sow distrust and disillusionment. And contributing to this is the collapse of much of Canada's fourth estate, its local and national media. Some 300 news outlets have vanished within the past decade, with the rest hanging on only because of an overdue and insufficient public subsidy. So you want it dark? 2024 was supposed to have been the year of mass democracy. In an unusual alignment of electoral calendars, a quarter of the world's population will or has cast a ballot, 2 billion of them in more than 50 countries. In better times, this would have been cause for celebration and tribute. Countries would, issue stamps, or the UN would say solemn and worthy things. After all, this should be a demonstration of democratic strength, several centuries in the making. So why then do we see so many signs of weakness? Well, it's because since I was a student here and well before, the warning signs have been flashing. and we choose to ignore them. And rather than take them seriously, politicians keep trying to squeeze out one more win and treat a deeper sickness like a passing cold. The simplest measure, voter turnout, has been eroding in this and virtually every other Western country for the past 30 plus years. By the early 2000s, everyone was talking about a democratic deficit. We can all say it together because it marks the start of 1,000 popular and academic articles. The PhD's with me now. The decline of trust and confidence in government and public institutions, right? That's how all the papers start. But maybe it's a refrain whose repetition has numbed us to its significance. A few politicians in this country did pop up with promises to take the issue seriously. Some even created secretariats and ministries of democratic renewal, which after 20 years have accomplished exactly nothing. I'm told one politician, riding a wave of popular support, even promised to change the electoral system for good. So not unlike the other great crisis of our time, climate change, we persistently ignore clear warnings and make every excuse to keep up appearances and pretend that it's still business as usual. Even when party memberships vanish, even when parties discover that they can barely give them away, even when local nominations become something of a joke and then a national security risk. We keep telling ourselves this is normal, inevitable even, that political majorities won with minorities of just half the population voting is still winning. We've been lying to ourselves and about the games that we play. And when pressed, who do we blame? We blame the public for being apathetic or inert, for being ignorant, or worse, for not playing the game. And we do it even while watching all the things we know democracy needs slip away. Economic security and equality, a vibrant civil society populated by large member-based organizations, a strong, competitive, and independent media, energetic political parties with genuinely active memberships. This is like the min spec. But every one of these preconditions has been diminished or else hollowed out entirely. Maybe it's just nostalgia, but I do think now it helps to look back, to remember a period not so different than our own and less than a century ago. In America, the Roaring Twenties had given way to the Great Depression of the 1930s. A quarter of the US population was unemployed, and everywhere petty tyrants were making mischief. In Britain, Oswald Mosley, a one-time rising star of the Labour Party, who came within 100 votes of beating Neville Chamberlain, defected to create his new party, the British Union of Fascists. Thousands of black shirts brawled on the streets of East End London, but to the city's credit, they were matched 50-1 by more than 250,000 counter-protesters. Still, far too many were falling under the sway of authoritarian logic and demagoguery, and the fate of the world's democracies appeared to hang in the balance. In New York City, the original display of American fascism packed Madison Square Gardens, and incredibly, each week, 1/4 of the country tuned into the charismatic radio broadcasts of an increasingly anti-Semitic, fascist sympathizer and Roman Catholic priest, Father Coughlin, who I'm sorry to report to you was born in Hamilton, Ontario. In the midst of this turmoil, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, first elected in 1932, was making preparations to take a reluctant country to war. And while he began to set into motion the full might of American industry to supply the war effort, he was also preoccupied with the psychological effects of war. His answer was to establish the now largely forgotten Committee for National Morale. Now, the committee was made up of an extraordinary group of luminaries, including the husband and wife team of anthropologist Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead, alongside the child psychologist Erik Erikson and the pioneering pollster George Gallup, who, amongst other things, would write, with Bob Rae's father, a book about the promise of polling called The Pulse of Democracy. You see, mindful that John was the chair of the CRTC, you can see my efforts to inject a bit of CanCon. Now, Roosevelt understood the perils of war. He knew that if he was to successfully prosecute the war, his government would come to manage much of America's economy and critically its information. The habits of mind and beliefs of the American public would be forged by war. And so, the question he asked the committee was this: how could the American public be mobilized in a top-down command and control system to fight a total war against Nazis and not risk, in effect, becoming Nazis themselves, with an absolute view of their superiority and rightness? Right now, there's a lot of talk about the rise of the authoritarian personality. But in the early 1940s, the Committee on National Morale was tasked with understanding its opposite. How could government cultivate a democratic personality? Of course, to do this, they first had to define it. What was a democratic personality? Their answer is ingenious, and I believe is as relevant to our time as it was to their own. They concluded that a democratic people must have the ability to maintain confidence in their own identity while also feeling comfort in diversity. In other words, a confident pluralism. People need to be able to believe in themselves while also being able to take an interest in the beliefs of others. Now, the committee's insights filtered through the American government and became the organizing principle for 20 years of popular education and cultural programs that reached tens of millions of people. The committee recognized something about the plasticity of the public, that the public attitudes are not static, they can be shaped and reshaped. The democratic art was in the nature of the programming. Did it lead people didactically towards simple answers, or did it cultivate critical thinking and an appreciation for different perspectives? Necessarily, the committee drew a clear distinction between information and propaganda, a distinction that would find expression through separate arms of the American government's communication agencies, the best of which were preoccupied with developing strategies that could inform without indoctrinating. And in a surprising twist of transatlantic fate, the committee also included and collaborated with members of the German Bauhaus movement, who were vanguard modernists, not unlike John, preoccupied with what they called a new humanism that would find architectural expression in the design of light-filled spaces and crisp new typographical conventions that together would transform the built and visual environment in support of democracy and a set of universal aspirations predicated on social and material progress and greater equality. Their ideas provided a new vernacular for federal buildings, national exhibitions, fairs, films, books, and broadcasts, and alongside a new and incredible array of consumer goods, largely created the landscape for post-war American ideals. Now today, we might ask, what business does government have cultivating a democratic personality? And what would it entail? But faced with existential threats, FDR had little patience for this line of thought. He believed that only an inventive, high-energy politics operating at scale, meeting the power of its adversaries by using every economic, scientific, cultural, pedagogical, and communications tool available, could create and protect an environment safe for democracy. And backing this up was an audacious promise to deliver America four freedoms: the freedom of worship, the freedom of expression, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. His proposition was that an American secure from material need and violence, while enjoying the liberty to say what he pleases and worship whomever she wants, was an American capable of extending that same generosity to others and possibly to the world. And what followed was a burst of investment in cultural energy. Federal art, theater, and music projects, which combined employed 25,000 artisan workers to deliver hundreds of thousands of performances and artworks to an audience nearing 30 million. Then there's the Civilian Conservation Corps, which itself employed 3 million Americans. It was accompanied by a massive adult education and recreation program. In local communities, the Works Progress Administration built or refurbished more than 1,000 libraries, while elite institutions like the Smithsonian and the Metropolitan Museum of Art were mobilized as platforms for popular education. The Office of War Information struck up partnerships with news-gathering organizations and Hollywood alike to develop popular education programs, counter misinformation, and reduce public anxiety during a time of global uncertainty. And all of this is without mentioning the program that unlocked higher education and housing for fully 10% of the population, permanently transforming America's economy and society, the GI Bill. Now, the reason I'm describing all of this is because the purpose and the scale of this era stands so apart from our own. It was a time that faced directly and seriously its threats. And those threats are near mirrors for our own. Too much of Roosevelt's relentless ambition and his committee's insights have been forgotten. Today, especially today, they feel out of reach. But they still require us to ask, are we building up or only drawing down our democratic inheritance? And when are we going to stop playing small ball? You know, John Hopkins professor Yascha Mounk suggests an answer when he warned us 8 years ago that only 1/3 of young people in the US, Britain, and America consider it essential to live in a democracy. Now, it's only when we set against the backdrop of wartime America and the precipitous decline in support for what we might call democracy as the default that our own perennial calls to teach more civics in school sound laughably anemic, or incredible, if not surreal, that at a moment when our media landscape is clouded by misinformation and private news media are in free fall, that we would seriously consider defunding a public broadcaster. How do we make sense of this? Well, in another era, anticipating a very different American moment, Bob Dylan sang that he not busy being born is busy dying. So here's the thing about it. Let's not understand democracy as a static set of institutions or simple proceduralism. but as a propulsive force. Democracy always has to make audacious claims against the future. Otherwise, its present failings lead it to falter on its own hypocrisy. And this means that democracy really just has two settings. It's either moving forward or it's falling back. We can only believe in democracy, much less its future, if we also believe in people. And this leads to the next chapter of our story, which is our ambivalent relationship with the public. You know, one of the contradictions of democracy is that we simultaneously venerate and denigrate the public. We talk it up and we talk it down. In a society that should be demophilic, where we love the public, we often act demophobic, as though we're afraid of it. We see this reflected all around us, particularly in popular culture. Horrible, pessimistic classics like William Golding's Lord of the Flies warn us from a very tender age, really, it had no business being given to children. At a very tender age, we live in a brutal state of nature, and that no one can be trusted. When we get a bit older and sit in classrooms like these, we learn about things like the Stanford prison experiment, one of the cornerstones of 20th century social psychology, which magnifies the lie and has only recently been debunked as a fraud. We see contradictory attitudes towards the public baked into many of our most esteemed institutions. Lawyers make the money, judges have the authority, but it's still a jury of one's peers that remains the true engine of justice, trusted with holding even a former president to account. But where do we usually find juries? Usually in the lesser parts of a courthouse, cooped up in a fluorescent lit jury pen. Until called, that's where you sit, until you're most often dismissed. We see this in even our most hopeful politics. No sooner did Organizing for America, the mammoth grassroots network, succeed in electing the first black man president of the United States than it was disbanded. Almost every policy a government contemplates puts people at the end of the process, not at the beginning, with consultation either an afterthought or calculated to do an end run around more meaningful engagement. And this is the perverse thing. We keep sinking deeper and deeper into the habit of treating the public like a risk that we need to manage, rather than a resource to be tapped and renewed. And you know what? People can smell it. They know when they're not being respected, or when they're not welcome, or needed, or taken seriously. And so we find ourselves stuck in a cycle of mutual antagonism, where our beliefs about the public become self-fulfilling. We ask less, manage more, diminish trust, and when people inevitably act out or push back, we retreat further. And I think this cycle reveals a deeper issue. It's not only that people don't trust government, it's that our democratic governments don't trust people. It's their capability and energy that should be a democracy's source of strength. Only it isn't when we waste it. While we should be busy designing people in, we keep designing people out. And this inverted up-is-down view of the public is what is poisoning our democracy from within. Walter Lippmann, the great political commentator, the 20th century, famously referred to what he called the phantom public. And what he meant was the impossibility of a singular public that could fully grasp the complexity of the world. Better, he thought, to have well-meaning experts make decisions and keep the public well back. So can we now amongst ourselves at least agree that we've given that a go? In fact, we've been operating at such a remove from the public that if not a phantom, it has at least become something so distant and disembodied that each of us can just project onto it almost any prejudice or belief. So here's the test or thought experiment that I'm going to put to you. If we didn't already have juries, one of the oldest and purest expressions of our democratic ideals, would we, in our time, create them? So where to from here? My contention is that the only way to get out of this democratic rut is to rev the engines and fire up our democratic imagination once more. We need to stop thinking about democracy as being at its end and instead imagine that we have barely entered its adolescence. You know, here in Canada, the last big democratic wave is what secured for us responsible government and elected legislatures. It took about a century to fully take root between 1742 and 1848. But even then, it took another 11 decades to fully enfranchise our adult population. So that's 300 years, give or take, just to bed down the idea of the vote. But this achievement is not the end game, and our responsibility is more than maintenance. It's time to match the audacity of our first franchise by now adding a second, and write the next chapter in our democratic evolution. This photo is part of that story. The woman on the right should be immediately recognizable. It's Beverly McLaughlin, the former Chief Justice of Canada from Pincher Creek, Alberta. On the left is Don Sugimoto, a resident of Lethbridge, Alberta. For reasons you can each name, this photo could not exist 50 years ago, much less 100. And until this moment, they had never met. The former Chief Justice is there because she's chairing a 3-year commission on democratic expression and online harms for the federal government. Dawn is there because she got a letter in the mail inviting her to volunteer to serve on the commission's Citizens Assembly. It asked a lot of her, some 40 hours of her time, which is far more than any public meeting. But Dawn signed up, and her name was drawn alongside 41 others who won the civic lottery from every corner of the country. And a few months later, she was in this room. Dawn is awesome, but she isn't exceptional. She's one of 1,700 Canadians who have quietly been part of a vanguard experiment probing the future of democracy. Together, they've been demonstrating the capability and readiness of people to play a greatly expanded democratic role, but one which doesn't replicate the pathologies of partisanship or polarization and instead focuses on problem solving and finding common ground. It turns out that in Canada, we actually did reinvent the jury for our time. But true to ourselves as Canadians, we barely know our own stories. And while what began here in British Columbia's Citizens Assembly on Electoral Reform, a world first, and then continued here in Ontario, never delivered the electoral changes they intended, they did inspire what happened here in Ireland, where assemblies have gone totally mainstream and delivered stunning constitutional reforms, including legalizing same-sex marriage and finally ending Ireland's draconian abortion ban. Incredibly, In the 20 years since British Columbia held its first assembly, some 1,000 assemblies inspired by Canada have taken place around the world, which is why you can find remarkable photos like this one in Eupen, Belgium. What you're looking at is their regional parliament, and on the left are the elected parliamentarians. On the right are the randomly selected members of their citizens' assembly, which meet each year to determine one or more issues that other assemblies then examine in close detail. When I look at this photo, I'm reminded of this painting from the first Legislative Assembly in Lower Canada in 1792. Here are two paradigms of democracy meeting. On the left, the appointed legislative councillors, and on the right, the elected members. Imagine the suspicion, the confusion, the discomfort that must have been in that room, the nascency of an audacious idea being instantiated and making an extraordinary claim to legitimacy and power. See, in both images, just 230 years apart, democracy is being born. And it's here in the third chamber of the French Parliament, where the country's second National Citizens' Assembly is meeting to determine whether and under what conditions medically assisted dying should be legalized. In each instance, randomly selected citizens are being invited to play a role that goes far beyond voting. They're being asked to grapple with the hard work of government, to exercise public judgment, to work as public representatives, and with their peers to find equality that often eludes electoral politics. Consensus. Now, these assemblies are not only in high politics, but in local politics as well. Here I am, last month, chairing Canada's most recent assembly on the proposed amalgamation of British Columbia's capital, Victoria, and its neighbor, Saanich. Residents in both communities voted to create this assembly. 10,000 letters were sent to residents, and some 400 people volunteered. They'll spend 8 Saturdays together, and if they recommend change, then it goes back to referendum. And what I love about this is how quietly radical it is. Seated at the front are the city managers of the two communities and the region. The members of the public aren't lined up at a microphone or waiting to have their 5 minutes to deliver their deputation. Instead, the city managers delivered to them the same presentations they would have made to their elected councillors, explaining patiently and in detail how their municipalities operate. It's only possible because of a fundamental shift in how they understand democratic representation. See, this is at once a profoundly different way of doing democracy, but one that is wholly consistent with the trajectory of our democratic evolution. And somewhere in this photo is Dawn, seated in the final session of the Canadian Citizens' Assembly on Democratic Expression. Many of its recommendations have been written into Bill C-62, Canada's Online Harms Act that is struggling through Parliament and would regulate social media. To me, this photo is again illustrating democratic paradigms, two ideas about democracy, legitimacy, capability, and representation that are alive at the same time. One group of citizens in the foreground is setting another group of elected citizens in the background in Parliament, it's considered views. And it reminds me of what the Canadian-American novelist William Gibson said, that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And also of my own joke. I've been saving this one up because I'm in a school of policy studies. And so you're nerdy enough for this one, huh? What's the difference between a first-term MP and a member of the public?
First-term MP may know where the washroom is.
Ah, potentially. My answer is $500,000 in human resources. Right? Because this is the thing. When you're elected, you suddenly benefit from the resources of an institution on which we rightly spend $750 million each year. You get a scheduler and an assistant and colleagues to help you find your bearings and a whole library to supply you with research. Yet when we have a public meeting, what resources do we put in to support the people attending? And so I wonder, what would it mean if we spent even $50, much less $5,000, supporting citizens to play a bigger role? What I want you to see is that for everything that is wrong and deficient and menacing, we also live at a moment when we can see a new democratic idea coming into view. It's a vision of democracy where we all get to choose, but we also get to be chosen. It's this expansion of our democratic franchise that is at the core of what I think maximum democracy can look like. Maximum democracy is not a democracy of the simple majority or democracy of constant referenda. It's not voting on everything. Maximum democracy is a democracy where governing itself becomes a platform for cultivating the democratic personality of the mass public. Only to do this, we have to let them in. And I want to share one last photo, an example that I think gets to the heart of what's possible. This photo appeared in the New York Times in 2016. Sausan and Muaz Balani are standing at the center. Around them are the 4 different families which in 2015 joined together to sponsor the Balani's arrival in Canada. This group came together because the year before, Canadians were horrified when they saw that heartbreaking image of a young Syrian boy, Alan Kurdi, washed up on the shores of Turkey, his boat having capsized as his family tried to make their way to Greece. Canada immediately announced it would welcome 25,000 Syrian refugees through its refugee resettlement programs. But this wasn't nearly enough. Soon, Canadian groups like Lifeline Syria demanded that Canada do more, and in response, the federal government turned to its long-standing private sponsorship system, one of our most brilliant examples of civic innovation. The Groups of 5 program, as it's known, allows groups of Canadian families to sponsor a newcomer family and to help them get settled. Some of you may have been a part. It's a tall order. You have to raise $30,000 and take responsibility for housing, language instruction, employment, and schooling. Basically, these groups are left to figure it out and use their ingenuity, common sense, and local networks to make it work. It's a big responsibility. But with little prompting and without a major federal advertising campaign, more than 125,000 Canadians stepped up, almost doubling the number of Syrians Canada would ultimately accept. Not only did the Canadian public prove itself willing and capable. We also know now, 8 years later, that Syrians sponsored by these families have been doing as well or better economically than those supported by our hard-working settlement organizations. It's this experience, hiding in plain view, that gives us a glimpse of what's possible when we work with the public as partners. When we tap in to this enormous resource, we unlock the talents and ingenuity of our population. And in doing so, we create a sense of common purpose and collective efficacy. It's the kind of thing that builds up our society and ultimately strengthens our democracy. And contrast this, however, with the pandemic. In the early days of COVID-19, the federal government did think to activate Canadians. It invited us to volunteer by adding our contact information and a brief list of skills to an online registry. Presumably, you would help with contact tracing, or if you had medical skills, possibly deployed to help nursing staff. Again, almost overnight, 50,000 Canadians volunteered. But days later, the website disappeared, and no one was ever called. What we've since learned is that in an emergency, governments across Canada were more comfortable calling McKinsey and Company than calling on their own people. If ever there was a moment to mobilize the public, to raise an army and rush into the gaps our public services couldn't begin to fill, it was during the pandemic. And instead we were made spectators to a social tragedy. This is where we've gone wrong. We characterize our democratic challenges as problems of scarcity because we imagine the public to be too ignorant, selfish, or apathetic to do more. But our real challenge is a problem of abundance. We haven't begun to design the programs and services and opportunities to soak up the vast civic energy available to us. What prevents us is our prejudice. We're trapped in old beliefs about what people are, what leadership looks like, and what's possible. To be democratic, you have to love the public. All of it. Not just your segment or corner. We need to build a society that edifies the public and its potential. Last February, I received a letter from another member of Don's Assembly, Cheryl Lloyd, when Bill C-62 was introduced. Cheryl has done a lot of different jobs, and she once boasted to me about how when she worked in the Air Force, she was small enough to actually get inside the wings to clean the tanks. She wrote, "Peter, hi everyone. This is great news. I'm bouncing in my chair, trying to type. When this goes through, notice I'm being skeptically optimistic, we'll have done something concrete to help others. You know, I'm more proud of our work with the Citizens Assembly than I am with my 8 years of military service. Go figure. I'm holding my own these days, transitioning to a full pension and the attendant government screw-ups, and actually enjoying life now. My books are being recorded as audiobooks, and I'll have a bit more income coming in. No, I can't afford a trip to Toronto yet, but I'm working on it. My best to everyone." Every student of politics eventually learns Gramsci's maxim that the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. To meet today's monsters, We need maximum democracy and to find our faith in the public. While people want to say and will flood social media, they are also willing to serve. And so it all boils down to this. The problem isn't that we ask too much of people, but too little. And that in the end, democracy isn't how we vote. It's simply how we show confidence in ourselves. Thank you.